Thank you so much for inviting me here. This is a real honour. As an academic, I don't often get to speak to normal people. I get to speak to other academics, and the question of how normal they are is open, shall we say. I'm not sure how normal I am either, but hopefully normal enough. You'll excuse me if I snooze. This is I'm trying to integrate. This is my anpassning as a Swede. So, yeah, Guide for framtiden. In a way, the title should really be Guide for en framtid. It's about the limits of my Swedish, and I'll explain why it should be that way a little differently. But this is a good place to start. So what I want to do is I'm going to get straight to the main feature, if you like, and welcome you to a city called Notre Dame. And we do have copies of the books we produced that you can keep and take and read afterwards. Plenty to read in there. So let me show you around Notre Dame in the year of 2045. Now, Notre Dame is a large coastal European city. It looks a lot like a city you've probably heard of, but for reasons of copyright, obviously, it's not exactly the same as a city you might have heard of. And working with a city that was recognizable gave us a base to build these stories on. So let me show you around Notre Dame a little bit. So, I mean, if you're visiting a new city, one of the first things you want to know is where to get a good meal, right? And so this part of the guide explains to you the sorts of things that you might be able to eat in Notre Dame. And you would find all the normal things there. But you would also find things like beef burgers made from synthetic meat rather than from animals. You might also find mystery crustaceans in the Asian restaurants, you know, insects, shellfish, that sort of stuff. You might also find lab cultured meat. You might find food that has been recycled from stuff thrown away from supermarkets. So lots of interesting new flavors and much more sort of circular economics going on in the food available in this city. Outside of the city, if you were to venture outside, you would be able to find cooperative farming operations, a sustainable forestry zone in which people actually also live and work. But then you might return back to the city and think, well, I want to see the life of the city. I want to see where the action is, what's going on, do a bit of shopping, do a bit of hanging out. And so you might return to the downtown area. And downtown, you would find all the usual things, but possibly things that you're not used to finding in big cities at the center of town anymore. Like a big hospital at the center of town, with lots of facilities for elderly care, but some stranger things as well. So bear in mind, this is 2045, right? We're a long way from now. So you might find a hotel where where the decor is themed around the disposable fashions of the 2020s. A fashion for disposable fashion has very much faded away by this point. You might also find former shopping malls which have been turned into, I guess, what we might call experience locations. You don't go there to buy things, you go there to find things out, to do things, to maybe to learn things or to make things yourself. How are you going to get there? I mean, assuming, if you live near to the country that this city is in, that's pretty easy. You get on the train. But coming to Europe from farther afield, flying is possible, but very expensive, right? Because the tax on aviation fuel is kicked in. And besides, most responsible travelers don't want to travel that way anyway. So travelers from further afield might come by long distance train. They might even sail. We might even see a return to sailing from the American continent to Europe. But what about getting around inside the city, right? And this is a big priority for me as a Malmö person. You need to get used to riding a bike everywhere. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever visited Holland anyway. If you think that Swedish cyclists are good at kind of taking up their allotted space in the world, Dutch cyclists are the first time I visited, I nearly got knocked down a few times because if you're in the bike lane, they really do not care. So another 25 years ahead, we can imagine that's going to be even more the case, because we're going to see an expansion of bike lanes, very much a focus on big urban areas relying on people-powered transport. But that's not the only way to get around. There is, of course, public transport. And with public transport, of course, comes rules and etiquette for how to use it appropriately and not offend your fellow travellers, your fellow citizens, so on and so forth. And there's also advice for people who do arrive by car, which basically boils down to you can't use it in the city, and get used to people being very annoyed if you try to. So, how and why did we make a guidebook to an imaginary city? It's a good question. What I hope has been clear about what I've shown you is that the city we have depicted here is adjusted not just to climate change, but to changes in the things that cause climate change. As Ingvar said, yeah, it's not that people are using no fossil fuels at all, but the use of fossil fuels has been massively, massively reduced. This has not solved everything, okay? And we have to be really, really clear about the fact that we need to make these changes, but we cannot go back to how things were 30 years ago. It's too late for that. But accepting that and adjusting to it is a really important part of making the changes we need to make. And that's one of the reasons we wrote this book. Many of the instructions and depictions of the future that we get from governments and companies are very top-down. Okay, they're sort of like, well, you know, they say, well, we'll stop using fossil fuels, and that's great. That's what we need to do. But in terms of ordinary people's lives, that opens up questions. It's like, well, okay, great, we stop using fossil fuels, but how do I get my kids to school? Where do I do my shopping? How do I get downtown to see my friends? What's going on downtown when I get there? So the idea here is to make this carbon reduced, or ideally carbon-free future more recognizable to people whose concerns are not necessarily about fossil fuels or governance or policy or whatever it is. Because without the support and recognition of people at the bottom of the stack, if you like, of governance, without their support, without their recognition, the changes can't be made. It's all very well to stand there in the Reichstag or in the Parliament in London and say, well, we must do this. But it's us that actually has to do it, right? And so we have to know what that will look like, what it might look like for us, for our children, for our friends. So, more practically, this guide was part of a large project called Reinvent Decarbonisation, which is a Horizon 2020 project, which I presume doesn't mean much to you as non-academics, but that's academic speak for big EU funding. Okay, very big deal. This is not by any means the entirety of the project. This is in fact just a very small corner of it. A corner of it called Work Package 6, again, to use the academic speak. And Work Package 6 originally said, right, well, we will produce a handbook for best practice in decarbonisation. And if you're thinking, well, that sounds a bit meaningless, that's exactly what we thought as well. I mean, the idea that you can produce a guide to how to best do innovation is a bit absurd on its face, right? I mean, how can you sort of say, oh, yeah, oh yes, this is the best way to do innovation? Because innovation is about doing things differently to how they've been done before. And so we were, you know, we had this task assigned to us, and we were like, well, we could do the usual thing that these projects do, which is to produce a report that goes to policymakers in Brussels, and they spend 2 minutes looking at it and they say, oh, that's wonderful, thank you very much. And nothing ever gets done about it again. We thought, well, you know, like I've just said, this is a question that concerns everyone, and we should make these issues more accessible to ordinary people. We should make them more interesting. Hopefully, we should make them a bit entertaining, and at the same time, present the very real possibility of this change well, in a way that people can recognize their own concerns and lives in. And so that's what we did. In terms of how we actually, you know, the actual process of making the guide. So yeah, this was a big project, lots of experts on the dairy industry, the paper industry, the plastics industry, the steel industry. Steel industry, very exciting in Sweden at the moment. So we had all this expertise and these ideas about where where these industries might be going, how they might be changed, but we needed to translate that into, okay, well, say all this stuff happens, what does the world actually look like? What does a normal city that people might recognize look like with these changes? And so we had to kind of make this translation into a format that ordinary people recognize. Academic papers are great for academics, but a tourist guide is something that everyone knows how to read. We've already read a tourist guide at some point. And the great thing about a tourist guide is it's there to tell you stuff. It's a format that is really suited to showing and explaining what things look like. And I wish I could claim the idea to do a tourist guide was my idea, because that would be quite a coup. But no, that was my PI, Johannes Strippler. And he kind of threw the idea out in a meeting we had one day when we were trying to decide what to do with this work package. He said, well, what if we do a tourist guide? I was like, that is such a good idea. And we kind of just rolled from there. But obviously we had to get all these articles and ideas, all these places, we had to get things written about them. And we had to get the ideas from the project into those places. So what that involved is basically sitting down very serious academics in all sorts of very different fields and getting them to write about an imaginary city. So this is not actually the workshops in which we did that. This is an earlier workshop along a similar lines in which I got very serious academics to make models, which was quite a coup, I felt. We had a lot of fun doing it. And yeah, this may look very unserious, but this playfulness is how we get to serious ideas. You have to be able to experiment, you have to be able to think freely before you can narrow the pile of options down and start getting to the good stuff. I'm sure Ingvar would tell you the same, though of course particle physics is a slightly different deal to what I work with. So yeah, we assigned people little prompts, if you like, little questions. We said, right, okay, we kind of set up the idea of this imaginary city, and we said to people, right, you need to tell us about the best hotels in town. You need to tell us about what there is to eat. You need to tell us about what are the good areas to go to. You should tell us about what the areas we don't want to go to. You should tell us how we get around, how to visit the place, how to travel. And we just assigned little writing assignments, a couple of 100 words each, and we collected a big pile of them. But obviously, a book like this needs to speak in a kind of in a coherent voice. It needs to sound not like a pile of little notes. It needs to sound like a thing that is together. It needs to have its own voice. And so that meant once we had that big pile of little stories and stuff, someone had to go through and kind of edit them, make sure the punctuation was right, get all the words correct, get them all in the same voice, and then actually sort of stick them into a computer program that lays them out for printing. And that process kind of looked a bit like that. But I don't want to over dramatize it. It's actually a hugely fun part of the process, editing. I'm a writer by trade, but the experience of working with other people's writing and to make a real thing in the internet age is really quite special. To have a piece of writing that you can actually touch and put in people's hands. It's magic and a lot of fun. I enjoyed it, but it was pretty hard. And my God, the deadlines were terrible. So, yeah, we made a book. What have we done here? So at this point, I'm actually going to explain a bit more about how I came to be doing what I'm doing, which, as I remarked to Ingvar earlier, is a story that's still surprising to me, even though I'm 10 years through it. So, if you want to go all the way back, I'm mostly a failed musician who decided to turn into a science fiction writer sometime in the mid-noughties. And in 2010, I went to London to do a master's in science fiction writing. While I was there, I got a research assistant's job at Sheffield University, working with engineers who were thinking about the future of infrastructure and how they would change things. So I was already thinking about how the future worked because I was writing science fiction. But all of a sudden, I was working with people who were thinking about it in a much more sort of concrete and practical way. And I was like, well, I think I can help with that. I think there's a lot of power in, and obviously if you're doing engineering, you need to know numbers, stress figures, materials, traffic capacity, so on and so forth. Very serious, hard science figures. But the stories we tell about the bridges or railways or ferry lines or whatever it is, the infrastructures that we need and want, even when they involve all those hard figures and complex sums, we still tell stories about them. And particularly when we talk about them to people who aren't engineers, just the people who are going to use these things, then we need to be able to talk about them in a way that's understandable to ordinary people. That is, we sometimes talk in my work about despecializing specialist subjects. That's not to say we make them simple, that's to say we put the complex stuff aside and we talk about the stuff that's accessible. Complex stuff for the experts, accessible stuff for everyone else. Because like I said earlier, we need the consent and the understanding of ordinary people to make the changes we need to make. So yeah, I'm a science fiction writer who somehow ended up in a political science department, writing science fiction, basically. This is a story about the future. It's not a novel, it's not a short story, it's not a film, but it's still a story about the future. And that's quite an important thing. Now, obviously, there is, people have been thinking academically about the future for a very long time. Arguably for hundreds of years. In terms of how we think about what we call future studies these days, it probably dates back to the Second World War. Basically, at that point, that's a point at which major governments had to do an awful lot of planning about production and strategy and so on and so forth. And a lot of those ideas, when the war finished, were applied to thinking about how you run a country, how you run a business, so on and so forth, which was very useful. But it was very, very much on the kind of engineering-y, businessy side of things, which is totally necessary. But what got lost along the way was the storytelling, the imagination, the thinking about the future we want. It's all very well to think about the things that will be in the future we want, but until we know what the future we want looks like, it's very hard to decide what things should be in it. And so for a long time, most of that thinking about the future we want kind of fell to science fiction writers. Lucky us, right? But in recent years, there has been much more of a move in academic fields and in the social sciences particularly, to saying, okay, well, we need to do more serious academic work on thinking about how futures work, how we tell these stories, what we want the future to look like. And lots and lots of different methods have come up with that. So we still have the very serious future studies guys who do trends and graphs, and they look at lots of data and they extrapolate and they plan. And that's great. But when they come up with these plans and these designs, we need to be able to present them in a way that people can understand and that people can contribute to as well. So people can add their own ideas to what the future looks like. And that's the sort of work I've ended up doing. Now, this may seem fairly radical to you, I don't know, but it's not as radical as what some people do. So a lot of my colleagues in the academy and outside of it do what is commonly called design fiction. Now, design fiction it's based on ideas from science fiction cinema and from product design, but it's not about designing a product that you might then send to a shop to sell someone. It's about designing products that say, well, what if we had this? So it's asking the same question that science fiction asks, because the question at the heart of every science fiction story is what if? But instead of doing it as I would do it, with words on a page, design fiction does it with objects and images. Let me show you a few examples. So this is a piece of work from 2011 by a man called Julian Oliver. It's called the Transparency Grenade. Now, just to be very clear, it's not a real explosive device, and it's not functioning. It's a piece of art in a way. It's designed to be shown in museums. But it was also designed to tell a story about the possible future. Now, this was made in 2011, which was very much the time of WikiLeaks and exposure of information, concerns about privacy on the internet. Not much has changed in that over the last 10 years. And so this was a way of Oliver telling a story about a possible future, saying, well, what if there was a device that could kind of suck up people's information and then kind of explode it out again? And it's in engineering terms, it's possible. That's not the point. what it lets us do is think about a world where the relationship between those who hold information and those who want it has changed. This here is adopted image by a friend of mine called Tobias Ravel. And he was here interested in, he'd read a story. It's very much the way a science fiction writer would approach this sort of issue, right? You read about a new technology, you think, ooh, what would happen if someone did something weird with that? So he read a story which was about some sort of fungus, which a researcher had determined could be used as a source of energy. It's not like a fungus battery, if you like. And one of the stories we ask in science fiction very often, it's an idea from a guy called William Gibson, who you might have heard of if you write that sort of stuff. We often say, right, well, yeah, okay, what happens when this thing gets to street level? What are people going to do with this? In the same way that, when the internet started, people were like, oh, well, we'll do very serious things with the internet. And then the internet happened and people send cat pictures to each other, right? It's about thinking what happens when people without very serious and high-minded and practical business goals, what happens when they get hold of this? So Tobias imagined that maybe, so this fungal battery thing might not be very successful as a business model, but in slums in the third world.
Ja, det var hårdvärd, hej. Nu kommer jag snart till dig.
And sometimes the future just jumps in.
Är du uppe? Är du uppe? Ja, det är bra. Ska jag ha någonting med mig, eller?
Anders, stäng av mikrofonen.
I'm clearly not being interesting enough. So Tobias came up with a story where people living in slums in the third world, in places where the electricity companies would not supply them electricity. So they get hold of these fungi and grow them, and they use them to power their apartment. Now, again, probably impossible from an engineering point of view, but it opens up all sorts of questions about how we get energy to people, who's allowed to get it, how much it costs. It allows you to explore these questions in a much more accessible way than presenting someone with tables of figures and graphs about electricity lines, so on and so forth. One final example, another group of good friends of mine, they're a design studio called Superflux, based in London. And they did an exhibition a couple of years ago, which has now actually been touring the world, called Mitigation of Shock. And what they did is they actually took an apartment in London and they turned it into a kind of art installation. So you step into this apartment and you step into a different time, you step into a future. And it's a pretty grim future, to be quite honest. In Mitigation of Shock, what has happened is we have failed to reduce our carbon footprint. The environment has got much hotter, and agriculture has become next to impossible. So these people live in their apartment and they have to grow their own food in the apartment using hydroponic equipment. So you get a kind of, by stepping into this apartment, you kind of step into this future and you can touch it and you can see it in all its details. And it's not a nice story, but it's a powerful story. It makes people think, because all of a sudden it's not just sort of like, I often say to people, we talk all the time about, we must stay below 2 degrees of warming, and we must. But what does that even look like? What does 2 degrees of warming look like? Do you know? Because I don't. Right? So doing that research and saying, okay, 2 degrees of warming, what does that look like? What does that mean? What are the consequences? What does that feel like for you to live in it? What would you have to do differently? And then what these people do so brilliantly is to make that in a way that you can step inside it and experience it. So that's design fiction. So what we have been doing at Lund is we've been borrowing ideas from there and from science fiction, which is a related tradition, and taking that with the best research in engineering and science, but also the social sciences as well. And we do what we call narrative prototyping. So we're kind of going back to stories on a page a little bit more, but we're doing the same sort of work. With this book, we're trying to take you to 2045, okay? We're not saying this will happen. We're saying that this might happen, and if it did, this is what it might look like, okay? I've got this quote by a writer I greatly admire, who kind of makes the point for me. Mike Harrison is a science fiction writer, but not the sort of rockets and ray guns science fiction writer. And this point here he makes is why I said at the start, it should be en framtid rather than framtid. See, especially when you hear stories from the guys who run Silicon Valley, they're always saying, well, in the future, this will happen. In the future, that will happen. In the future, we'll live on Mars. In the future, we'll have the metaverse, whatever the hell that is. But there's not just one future, right? Every decision we make, every single one of us every day, changes the future we get. So we talk instead in the academy about futures, plural, framtiden, more than one, many, many, many different futures. And anyone who tells you they can predict the future is a liar. And you can tell them I said so, and you can send them my email address, and I'll tell them myself. No one can predict the future. We can get an idea of where it might be going, generally, in the same sense that you can look at the horizon when you're out walking and say, well, I think we're heading that way. But you're heading towards, I don't know, a tower on a hill. You're walking through the forest, and all of a sudden there's a lake in the way. So you have to go around it. So you head in that direction, and maybe when you get to the other side of the lake, you think, well, that tower's over there, but there's something else I want to see over there that looks better. And so the route changes. Anyone who says, oh yeah, I can draw you a line from here to the future, they're lying to you. Always, always distrust anyone who tells you they can predict the future. This is not about prediction, what we do. And there is, of course, a politics to futures, to futurity. And this is a small p politics. I mean, there's a big P, party politics to it. I'm not going to go there. That's for my colleagues in political science. I don't do that sort of stuff. But there is the politics in the sense that politics is the question of who gets to do what and when and how and why. That's the politics we're talking about. And so I often say to people, we have three principles that guides the work we do. Our work is to concretize the challenge, which means to take the abstractions of something like climate change, the 2 degrees of warming thing, and say, okay, what does that actually look like? We have to situate the consequences. Now, what that means is the fact that 2 degrees of warming looks very different here in Skåne to how it looks in the Midwest of the US, to how it looks in sub-Saharan Africa, to how it looks in China, to how it looks in Antarctica. So the question is, okay, what do those challenges and consequences look like here? Because that's how you get people who don't have a scientific background to recognize that world that you're talking about. You make it their world. You put those consequences in their world. And the third point is to democratize the discussion. What we really need to get away from, as I said earlier, is this idea where people in the Reichstag or Parliament or wherever it is say, oh, well, this is what we must do. And they write a law that says we must all do it. Everyone's like, I guess we need to do that, but how? We need to democratize that discussion. The question of how we make these changes is everyone's responsibility because we're all implicit in it, right? It will affect us all, but we all need a voice in that. And there's a huge untapped reserve of expertise. We have political scientists who know political science. We have particle physicists who know particle physics. We have science fiction writers who know how to write science fiction. But I'll tell you, no one knows about Staffanstorp as well as you guys, right? So if anyone's going to think about the future of Staffanstorp, you guys should be in that discussion. Pretty simple, but it doesn't really happen very often, does it? I will come back to that point. So I'm not sure if this pun works in Swedish. Do you have the saying, here today, gone tomorrow? Here today, gone tomorrow? Maybe not. Anyway, you can't say I didn't try. So, thank you. So, yeah, I've talked about this particular book. This is not the only thing we've done like this. I'm going to take you briefly through a bunch of other futurings that we have been doing recently. So this one, the Museum of Carbon Ruins, has been very successful. It was based in Lund at first, but it's toured around Sweden. It's been written about in the UK, in the US, and all sorts of other places. We've also done performances related to it in Norway and in Germany, and there will probably be more to come. And so it kind of does what it says on the tin. It's, instead of being a guidebook from 2045, it's a museum from 2041. And the museum shows objects from its past, which is our present, and recontextualizes them, right? It takes the visitor into that time by showing them objects they recognize and saying, but that isn't that anymore, right? So here's a few examples. So a steel water bottle, right? So as our ways of making steel and our need for steel changes, a steel water bottle, which is a kind of common everyday object, might become quite precious. Asphalt from a road, right? Very common everyday object now. But if we're going to stop using fossil fuels, we're going to have to use something else, right? Fast food burgers, lumps of coal, frequent flyer cards. Anyone here got a frequent flyer card? No, you don't seem the frequent flyer card type, but there are lots of people who have those, people who are rewarded for flying more. How might people look back on that in 2041 and say, my God, they used to reward people for flying more? Right? That's an incredibly powerful object. Actually, my colleagues who've done the guiding to the museum, so that's the one that really gets people. They're like, I saw your face, sorry, your name, and just that sort of like, what? We rewarded people, and all of a sudden you're put in the position of looking back on the now from a future we haven't yet gotten to, and that's really powerful because that lets you in to that future in a way that no amount of just simply explaining about it or writing about it can ever do. And there's other objects as well, Lego, AstroTurf, so on and so forth. People are often surprised to find out how many things are made with oil. It's, I'm pretty sure that some of the ladies here are probably wearing stockings or tights today, made with an oil product, right? It's, you're wearing oil. So another thing that you can do, so that the Museum of Carbon Ruins is, I think, out on tour at the moment. It will probably return to Lund. When it does, please do and go and see it. One thing you can do now, because it doesn't move, so you can get an app on your phone and you can go down to Julia in Malmö and you can do the Memories from the Transition Walk. And basically you put your headphones in and as you move around the area, you're told a story from 2050. And I don't want to spoil it for you. Please, it's completely free to use. And I know I'm biased because it was made by my colleagues, but it's a really powerful and affecting story. It's really very, very moving. And it gets you again to walk around that part of Malmö and really think about how it might look different in 2050. So storytelling again, but a different medium. So using audio and sound and the landscape itself to tell the story. And I also brought some of these with me as well. A few months ago, we finished making a special issue of LUM magazine, which is published in 2041. And that lets us talk about the futures of higher education and research. But again, it lets us do that in a way that gets it out of specific disciplinary concerns. And it also makes it accessible to people who may not be researchers or academics themselves. And again, we get to kind of borrow a format that's familiar. And so, you can, it's like dressing two kids up in a raincoat to go and buy beer in the store, right? It's like, it's just LUM magazine. I know what that does. What's really interesting as well is that we have had people pick this up and say, it took me 5 minutes to realize this wasn't published this year. The format is so recognizable, you can kind of sneak ideas under the radar before people expect it. That's really powerful because we're cynical, right? We become very cynical about the future. And so, everyone's so busy trying to tell us, it'll be like this, it'll be like that. If you can get people exposed to it without the cynicism kicking in, that's when you really get people thinking for themselves. And, people have said to us, I don't agree with this bit, or that won't happen like that. We say, great, write us a letter, write back to us, right? Because it's not about saying this is what the future will be. It's saying this is how a future might be. Might become completely different. There's things we're going to have missed. We're good, but we're not perfect. And things that we don't know. And those people over there know things that none of us know. We need everyone in the room. We need everyone having a conversation about how the future might be. So to go back to those principles, number 3 is the tricky one. The democratization, because it's not technically difficult. It's not that we don't know how to do it. It's just that we're kind of out of the habit. Okay, especially in the academy, we're not used to going and, like I said earlier, talking to normal people. It's a bit scary. But like I said, you people have an expertise. You know, there's no professor of Staffenstorp, right? So if we want to think about the future of Staffenstorp, we need to get the expertise in Staffenstorp, and it's right here. It's in Staffenstorp. So we should be thinking about it here with you, because yeah, we know things that you don't know. You know things that we don't know. So why are we not sharing them? That's how it's happening. So my current project, which has technically been running for a year, but then this whole pandemic thing happened, which has made it rather difficult. So my idea with this project was, right, okay, well, we do something like the Notre Dame guide, but we do a guide to Scorner. So not an imaginary place, a real place. I said in my funding bid, right, I'm going to do this, but I'm going to go and talk to people who actually live in these places, and we're going to do it that way. We're going to democratize it. And it turns out you can't do that when you're confined to your apartment because of a pandemic. But I still have about 10 months left, and we are sort of ramping up and getting ready to get this done, which I'm hoping will be as exciting and well received as this. And so I'm going to finish with an invitation, because like I said, what we want to do with this project is we want to do this sort of futuring with the people whose futures it is, in the places that they know. And so in return for your generous invitation for me to come and speak to you today, I would like to invite you in turn. Would you and your local colleagues here at the Rotary Club, would you be interested in doing a workshop with us to think about the future of Staffenstorp? Because I would be delighted to come and do one with you. And I think it could be a lot of fun for everyone involved. You know, no need to answer right away. We can talk about dates, we can talk about logistics, but the invitation is very much there. And on that point, I will end. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for listening.